Hey everybody, this is Heidi from the blog Hands Occupied with an Intarsia knitting video tutorial for you today. So Intarsia knitting is sometimes referred to as picture knitting, and it's the process by which you knit more than one color to create a standalone motif. So in the case of this video, I'm going to show you guys the basics of knitting a square, specifically a cream colored square, on a bed of navy stockinette stitch. So on my needles here, I have cast on a little north of a dozen stitches, and I've worked stockinette stitch, so knit one side, purl one side, with a 2-stitch garter stitch border, just so it doesn't curl up on you while you guys are trying to watch what I'm doing. All right, so what we're going to do here is pretend that we're doing an Intarsia knitting pattern, that we're working from an Intarsia knitting pattern. All right, so we've knit a few rows, and now it's time in our chart or our pattern to add our second color. So I'm just going to work my row until the point where my pattern says to add my next color. So I'll pretend it's right here. So what we're going to do is just grab the tail end of our second color and wrap it over our working needle or our right hand needle, like so, and just knit that first stitch. Leave a tail that's about 4 to 6 inches for weaving in ends later, and leave that tail hanging at the back of your work. Okay, next what you're going to do is work in that next color for as many stitches as your pattern calls for. Let's do 7. All right, cool. So now we have worked 7 stitches in our second color. But the big difference between Intarsia colorwork knitting and Fair Isle or stranded colorwork knitting is that you're not carrying any yarn with you at the back of the work. So we've got our tail that we joined here from our second color. That's just hanging loose. And this is the first end of our other color, okay? So what we need to do is find another end of this navy yarn to work with. The method I like to use for really basic, just 2-color Intarsia is grabbing my entire skein, this kind of messy guy from my stash right here, and finding the other end of it. So I'm going to unwrap this a fair amount so we have this to work with. So what we're doing right now, if I lay out all of my ends so you can see everything I'm doing here, what we're doing here is we've got our first tail from the center of our skein, and we've worked that in our stockinette swatch back and forth to this point. All right, and please remember we're working flat and not in the round Intarsia, and the round is a whole separate thing. Okay, so this is the working end of that first tail, and that's all attached. Then we joined our second color of yarn here, and there's the tail end of that one, and we've worked 7 stitches. But now we need to finish our row right here with the other end of the skein of that first color. So this and this right here are coming from opposite ends of the same skein of yarn. So one's coming from the middle and one's being pulled from the outside. I personally really like this method for really simple Intarsia color work. Some people hate it because it's easy to get tangles in your yarn as you go, but it's worth a try because if you can tolerate the tangle factor and manage it as you go by manually untwisting your yarn, this can be a really efficient technique that just lets you get on with it in terms of knitting your Intarsia. Okay, so continuing from where we left off, we just did our 7 stitches in our cream color, and now we're going to join the opposite end of our skein. So just like before, we give ourselves a little bit of a tail, wrap that around the next stitch on our needle, and then let the tail hang at the back of our work while we continue that row of knitting, like so. All right, now we've finished that row. And again, taking a quick look at all the different tails so you can know what I'm working with here. Pardon my circular needle sliding around. So we've got our first tail. We've got our first tail down here from our first end of our skein. We've got the second tail here. We joined our other color and worked 7 stitches. There's the tail and the working end. And then we started working from the opposite end of our skein of yarn. Make sense? Cool. If not, pause and rewind and let me know if you have any questions. All right, so what we're gonna do is turn our work to the wrong side to keep going, all right? So what we've gotta do there is just turn our work. One thing that can help with tail management is if you always turn from right to wrong side, going one direction, and then when you finish that row, turning back the opposite way. So you're not introducing an excess twist in your work. So pro tip there. So we're gonna turn this way to start working the other side of our work. And I'm gonna let all these tails hang towards our body or at the front of our work. And we're looking at the wrong side. All right? So now we're gonna work using the first strand of yarn that's available to the point where we need to work our second color. All right, so we're going to work the pattern like so until we come to that cream color that forms the base of our square. So we've worked all the way up to that color change. Now is the key technique part of Intarsia, all right? One thing I always do when I have a color join of any kind, even if I'm just switching skeins, is I grab the tail and tighten up that loop that I joined on, just because it'll help it not gap and it just kind of lays nicer while I work. So what we're gonna do is switch to our second color. So to do that, and this is how you always switch colors in Intarsia, we need to interlock these 2 strands of yarn here. So we need to interlock our navy and our cream, okay? Because if we just grabbed the cream yarn and knit with it, we'd end up with this huge hole where our colors were meeting in our knitting. So to avoid that problem, we need to interlock those strands. And to do this, the key phrase to remember, and I learned this from one of my favorite designer idols, Julia Farwell Clay, you should really check her out. Just a quick shout out there. So to do this interlocking, you need to take your 2 strands of yarn and you need to bring up the color that you're switching to from underneath the color you've been working with. So in this case, we're gonna bring the cream up from underneath the navy. And so by doing that, we have completely interlocked, we've completely wrapped the cream yarn around the working navy yarn. And now we're in position to continue knitting, but with that cream color. So to do this, we're on the purl side, so we need to purl. So we insert our needle into the next stitch. I've already interlocked those fibers by bringing the cream up from underneath the navy. And now we're going to purl across all those cream stitches. I believe it was 7 total stitches. All right, and now we need to switch back to navy, but this is a different strand of navy. This one is, that we're about to work into and interlock with. This is the strand of navy from the other end of our skein. So once again, I'm just going to tighten up that join loop by tugging on the tail. And now we need to bring up the navy from underneath the cream. So we've got our working cream yarn right here. We're going to bring that over the navy yarn we're switching to and bring that navy up from underneath so it completely crosses over the cream. And so if you're just working in your row, what that looks like is inserting your needle into the next stitch, making sure that the cream yarn or whatever color you're switching from is over the top of the working yarn you're drawing up from underneath, in this case navy, so that you can interlock those fibers, those strands of yarn, and not end up with a gap at the color join. Like so. So right here, you can see, even with just 2 rows of working with this cream yarn, you can see that there are, I'm gonna get these tails out of the way and make sure there's white on the background so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. How's that looking? That looks good. So looking at the right side of our work, you can now see that even with just 2 rows, yes, there are a couple of gaps here and here, right where we joined the cream and the navy, But when we go to weave in our ends, we can sew those shut ourselves, and that's just one of the evils of working with Intarsia. But otherwise, you can see that there's no gapping where the navy and cream come together because we drew those strands up from underneath on the color change, and they interlocked almost like a handshake. That was another term I learned from Julia Farwell Clay. They interlocked, forming their little handshake on the back of the work to create a seamless color change row without having floats or stranded knitting. So it looks like a lot, as you can see here, and I definitely understand why some people are just not fans of Intarsia. The thing is, though, from a design perspective, it opens up so many possibilities for knitters, and it is worth giving it a try in case, if you're like me, Intarsia immediately clicked and became this whole new world of colorwork knitting that you might end up really wishing you knew about before. That's the case with me. If that's not the case with you and you need more tips and tricks and questions, go ahead and reach out to let me know, and I'll help as best I can. Thanks. One last thing about working from both ends of your skein in Intarsia is that when you are ready to stop working with your second color, or multiple colors depending on the pattern you're working with, what you need to do, and I've already done it here, you need to cut two strands, the two strands you're no longer going to need to work with, of your second color and first color. And so how you know which of that first color, in this case the navy, the way you know which of those colors to cut is it the color you're about to work, in this case, all the way across the row with. If it's not that color you're about to work all the way across the row with, you can cut the other one. So you can cut the color that you're not about to work all the way across the row with, let it hang at the wrong side of your work, and you know you're at the wrong side because you can see all those interlocking stitches that we've been working on. And then you simply work your pattern as directed with your now single color of yarn. So you work all those stitches, and then when you get to that second color, instead of doing the interlocking and switching to the cream color, you're just gonna keep on trucking. Work all the way across those stitches. If you end up with kind of a loose loop like here, like right there, you can just pull on that tail to tighten it up and continue on working. Again, you don't need to interlock when you come back to these stitches that are not part of this cream colored square because you've trimmed that other length of yarn. You just, again, keep on trucking. And the mantra I always like to keep in mind when knitting Intarsia, especially when I'm working from both ends of the same skein, I really like to think to myself, get on with it, keep on trucking, and watch out for tangles every once in a while. So there you go. There's working from both ends of the same skein in Intarsia.